My special guest today is Professor Tukufu Zuberi, who is a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and the Center for African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Zuberi just recently launched and recently opened a new YouTube channel called Curating National Narratives, where he's going to be publishing some videos on African studies, African politics, the economy and society, as well as history. A lot of videos have now already been uploaded and are set for premiering in the next couple of weeks and couple of months. So today we're going to be listening to the presentation of the channel, the subject matter, the content that is going to be publishing on this. And I'm going to open the floor to questions just immediately after the presentation. So Professor Tukufu Zuberi, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, my friend. How are you today?
I'm doing very great. It's, of course, it's very cold here, but I'm doing great. I'm trying my very best to be warm.
Yes, it's cold here as well. I'm in Philadelphia and it's very cold here. Snow all over the place.
It's always important to be warm during these times with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
It becomes something else. So, Professor Zuberi, I do really want you to give this presentation. You know, during these times of COVID-19, the impact that COVID-19 has had on education has been tremendous. Many universities, colleges, and high schools are now forced to embrace technology as a means of disseminating knowledge and as well as conducting classes and so forth. And sites like YouTube, Facebook, and many others that are still being made have become an important tool for learning. And it is very important for any field of study to have educational videos uploaded on YouTube, uploaded on Facebook, so that people can get to access them. So I'm going to ask you to do this presentation. I'm going to give you about 20 minutes, and then we are going to open the floor to questions. So Professor Tukufu Zuberi, this is your time.
Thank you very much. You know, over the years, I've made a lot of documentaries, documentaries which are full-length documentaries, some which are short documentaries, and some which are what we're calling nowadays short documentaries, which are these documentaries which are, you know, 1 to 2 minute kind of things. And some of that I came about by, you know, doing museum curation and having some of these shorts in the museums. And so I want to take a moment and just give you a teaser of the different formats that I'll have on the channel. But I kind of want to say that the reason I did it is because I started doing all these Zooms since the COVID-19. And these Zooms took me all over the world. I was Zooming with people in Ireland. I was Zooming with people in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. I was Zooming, and I've been Zooming with people in London and people all over the United States. And so it occurred to me that making this kind of information generally available is beneficial. And somehow people thought what I had to say about Africa and what I had to say about the African diaspora, they found that interesting. So let me give a small preamble into kind of my perspective in terms of where I'm coming from and what I mean by national narratives and why I think that what I'm trying to do is curate these national narratives. Because I think for the main part, my work presents racial capitalist actions alongside the unceasing struggle against them. The people have fought against the marginalization which they have experienced. Now, the modern white logic, let me be clear about that, it kind of tautologically reiterates the kind of declared structural elements of humanity, citizenship, or personhood, racially prescribed within the destructive and creative impulses of modern racial capitalist formations in the last 500 years. And this creates a certain logic. You know, some people have a logic of Africa as poor. And I kind of reject that logic because Africa has been rich and continues to be rich. It has been rich in its people, which it shared with the world, and it created this capitalism by serving as free labor, etc. And Africa continues to be a source of great wealth. So how can the place with the major deposits of gold and diamonds and copper and cobalt and all these things be considered poor? So it's not resource poor, but it's its relationship to the world and the economies of the world that has rendered it poor. And so I'm interested in those conversations which are talking about how do we redefine this process. Now, by the 19th century, the earth was reorganized around our modern systems of racial lines, distinguishing citizens from non-citizens, right? And non-humans, and even defining some people as non-human, or defining them as less human, as a migrant, as an illegal migrant, as a undocumented migrant, as a displaced person, in some way taking away by these definitions some of their humanity. So in this context, what I mean by a racialized category of the citizen is someone who has entered this space of being rendered marginalized by how they are being talked about. And this occurs internationally because entire nations can be rendered in this way. So these racialized categories of citizens have become one of the most contentious components of the colonized and enslaving processes. Intellectuals, including social scientists, historians, literary scholars, have been a key element in these battles over what it means to be a human being and how we understand our humanness and what this prepares us to do as active citizens. So I want to say that I kind of like to write, to curate, to document, to film. I like to do all of these things as a decisive citizen scholar, someone who is committed to reclaiming our common citizenship in efforts to repair the earth and human society. And at the center of this project is the regeneration of the discourse of freedom, of justice and equality from those who fought against the colonizing, enslaving, and continue to fight against all the forms of marginalizing practices and structures that reproduce the violence of modern democracy as we are experiencing it. Now, have continued to maintain popular nationalist enthusiasm, systematic installing of a national narrative through administrative regulation, and that can be through constitutions, through censuses, and other forms of surveillance that modern states use to organize themselves, right? Or it can be through educational systems and mass media. And in this, you get it through fictional films, through music videos, through documentaries, through news, and through museums. And, you know, and in some ways, this becomes a way of either educating or uneducating people, a way of fostering the into ignorance or consolidating people's arrogance about their ignorance. And I'm trying to be an educator, so I'm trying to involve in that educating side, which help remove the ignorance so that people don't have to get arrogant about it. Now, European nationalism, as it's practiced in Europe and the neo-Europes, okay? And what I mean by neo-Europes are those places created by settler colonialism. And for me, that's the United States, that's New Zealand, that's Australia, that's Brazil, that's Colombia, that's Peru, that's all of these kind of outposts. And kind of the spaces that European colonization transformed in Africa and Asia, right? And this kind of European nationalism as it's practiced fosters a form of ideas about white supremacy that have distorted our ability to understand our humanity. So, you know, I'm trying to unfold a genealogy of coloniality that is marred by efforts to decolonize without recognizing how people have been racialized in their identity and how this racialization has marginalized most of us, whether we are white or other, whether we are Black or other, you see. So in this regard, my work has focused on three structural processes that exert kind of immediate power before and after the Industrial Revolution, and continues to be essential in the creation and the articulation of what I'm calling these national narratives. So the project focuses on how these narratives are constructed through demographic representation. You know, and here what I mean by demographic representation is those abilities to administratively regulate large human populations. This is historic that you would have populations this size and need bureaucratic administrative structures in the way that we have them to do that. And how public presentations memorialize what it means to be a human, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a person, whether this is a kind of historic memorializing or an ethnographic memorializing, whether it takes place in building a statue or in creating a museum or in creating an exhibit. And then there are the video narratives that use archival and film video to critically engage national narratives in a comparative fashion, in a way that we say this is what's going on. I mean, in some ways, the distortions of many of the conservative videos that you can find all over YouTube about, you know, conspiracy this, conspiracy, and there are conspiracies, but these theories of conspiracies where everybody is bad and certain groups of people are villainized are problematic, but the world is full of them. And how do you counter them? You have to have a conversation about that. So these national narratives are key elements in determining how capitalist formations, states and corporations define human beings and our rights. And these rights for the past 500 years, I'm saying, have been racialized. And so I've been engaged in this process of producing documentaries, of curating exhibitions in order to create a conversation which allows us to participate in how we are defined and who defines us. We released the first documentary on here. And so this was a long form documentary. It was the first one that I presented, and that is of African independence. I want to play you a small clip, which is basically a trailer for African independence. And then I want to play you a trailer for my second full feature documentary, which is called Before Things Fell Apart. So I want to contrast these. One is talking about African independence, and the one is talking about before colonization. So I'm going to start with the one before colonization, and then I'll give you some of and then I'll follow that with the one on African independence, but I'll interrupt the two. And then I'll move to two clips, which will talk a little bit about my museum curation and provide examples of how that works, okay? So let me start by sharing my screen and giving you a taste of that, okay? Let's see, where is it at? I think it's at this one. Okay. Can you see that there?
Al-Rahman al-Sadi
Yes,
was born on 28 May 1594. In 1656, he completed his chronicle, Tariq al-Sudan, A History of Western Africa. This documentary is inspired by this book and African oral history.
So this project is an effort to present Africa before European colonialism really took hold of the continent. and to do it from the perspective of a book written in Timbuktu in the 17th century, and then to use the voices of griots, griots in Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenne, and Bamako, and to allow them to tell the story and to use their voices to tell the story. And it's the commentary from the Tariq al-Sudan, which is the text, is done by Ursula Ruckers, a wonderful spoken word poet here in the United States. And she takes us through, as well as the words of these griots as they sing history. And you heard one of the female griots singing that particular history. So the idea was, how do Africans think about African history before colonialism? And does such a thing happen? Is it just something somebody wrote in a book in the US or something like that? And now, but I'm trying to give that narrative fully. So another project that I had is to look at African independence. And that's the one that we released the first episode. It has 4 episodes. We released the first episode of it on Monday. I mean, on Friday. Let me show you a clip from that, or just the trailer from that. It's just this brief trailer. I find these trailers are great ways to show the clips.
Sure thing. We would like to see that.
There you go.
Join me, Tukufu Zuberi, as I take you on a whirlwind journey of one of the largest and least known continents. Africa is not only the cradle of mankind, but home to some of the world's greatest civilizations, with over 700 million and 53 very different nations. Why is Africa like this? Like this? Like this? No longer a rhetorical question. Our investigation follows the chain of events that lead to modern Africa. This is a story about Africa's relationship with the world, told from the point of view of those who lived it and those who led the fight for change.
Okay. Now, here again, I'm trying to curate a conversation about the narratives of the creation of modern African states. And so I'm interested particularly in statecraft. How do people go about doing that? I hear all the dismissal that these African nations and the leadership are bad and all of that. And that's important to hear. And the critique of the modern African state is very critical for that conversation. But also critical for that conversation is to recognize the significance of what the African independence movement did, what it did for Africa and what it has done for humanity. And I contend that if you don't understand the African independence movement, it is impossible to understand the potential of a Black Lives Matter movement. It is impossible to understand the potential of a civil rights movement, whether that is happening in the United States or happening in Brazil or happening in Colombia or the struggle is in France or in Britain. That if you want to understand the potential of these struggles, you have to understand where and how Africa is situated as a continent and its role interacting with the world. Again, curating these national narratives as a way of helping us better understand what it means to be a human being. Now, here's an example of a short. I said I had some which were short shorts. Wait, no, first let me give you the intermediate one, which would be a short documentary. And so I'm gonna give you a brief hit of a short documentary that I did. And this is about curating Africa in museums. Curating Africa. Now look, 850 million viewers before COVID. You had 850 million visits to museums in the United States. before the COVID epidemic. And so this is one of the most important venues, spaces for teaching people about Africa, where they get some of their ideas about Africa. And you see some of this being popularized in Black Panther and in other films as people grapple with the significance of having all of these African materials in museums in the West. So let me just give you a small clip of one of these videos, okay? Let's see, where is that at? Okay, that's this one. Where did it go? Are you seeing that? Wait a minute. I don't see it.
Yes, we can see your screen, but you haven't started playing the.
I haven't started playing it. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know where it went. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay. Wait.
Yes.
In the beginning, Africa was a central part of the conceptualization of the Penn Museum. European colonial domination devastated the African continent. Penn thought about Africa using this colonial mindset. The foundational objects of this collection were created in or taken out of Africa during the periods of enslavement and colonialism.
Nous, on a rencontré l'Europe, il y a eu l'esclavage, il y a eu la colonisation, on est toujours debout. Non seulement nous sommes debout, mais nous avançons maintenant. On va passer au-dessus.
These galleries are designed to expand horizons and to deepen the conversation about African material culture and its representation in Western museums.
So anything done to uplift the culture, the history of the people here is done for the benefit of the world.
We invite you to consider how these objects were made, who made them, and how they came to be in front of you today. The dark history of enslavement and colonialism doesn't stop us from telling stories that celebrate Africa's contribution to humanity. What do you think about this conversation of decolonizing the museum?
It is very important the Western world understand that this is Africa. What belongs to Africa should be turned back to Africa.
So again, what we are trying to do there is that we redesign the Penn Museum, Africa galleries, by shifting the lens from just focusing on Africa, but also focusing on the museum. Why does the museum have these objects? What is the museum doing with these objects? And how should we understand them? And what kind of dialogue should we be having with the museum about having these objects? And what do African curators think about this? What do African museum directors think about this? And how can we foster a conversation about African material culture as it is represented in these museums as a way of enhancing how we talk about Africa and what is going on in Africa? And just one more clip, and then I'll stop and hopefully we'll have some conversation, okay? And this clip is of another gallery that we redesigned, and we curated a conversation about the African presence in the United States and what the African presence in the United States has meant, specifically focusing on a particular place, and that is the Delaware River and their arrival in the city of Philadelphia, and what the African presence has meant for the tides of freedom, the evolution of freedom, and the discussions of freedom in the United States, okay? So one more clip for you, how about that?
Yes, 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 let's see that.
There we go.
Zuberi, in this investigation of the tides of freedom, the African presence on the Delaware. This exhibit tells a story about freedom, slavery, despair and hope, obstacles and opportunity. Our story of the African experience takes place along the Delaware River, where liberty has ebbed and flowed for over 300 years. Journey through 300 years to explore this human story as it unfolds in and around Philadelphia's Delaware River. From enslavement to emancipation, to Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era, meet the enslaved, sailmakers, ship captains, labor organizers, activists, and more. Explore with me the tides of freedom.
Okay. So, basic idea is that what I wanted to do was engage in a conversation which focused on a critical interpretation of who we are and what it means to be a human being. And I wanted to do that in creative fashions, which for me, it takes me to teaching at a university, making documentaries, curating museums and exhibitions. And some of my exhibitions have traveled around the country and will be traveling around the world as we try to engage this process. And to do that with an independent mind of thinking about how we do these things without just uttering a perspective which bows to the social structures that exist now. I do not accept where we are. I want to challenge us on where we can be. And I want to speak with the voice of someone who is concerned about protecting our world and elevating the status of humanity. How about that, man?
That is wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Zuberi. He is a professor in the Sociology Department at the Center for African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He just recently launched a new YouTube channel called Curating National Narratives. I've just pasted the link right in the comment section, both on Facebook and on YouTube, for easy access so that we can like the videos and as well we can subscribe to the channel. Those of us joining us on this panel on this for this discussion, I would like to open this floor for questions directed to Professor Tukufu Zuberi. I do have questions for you, but I would just want to give the opportunity initially and firstly to those that are joining us right on this panel. Those of you who just want to indicate to me if you have a question for Professor Tukufu Zuberi, just indicate by raising your hand and then I can invite you in to ask the question. These documentaries clearly show that you have visited a number of African countries. I would be very much interested to know how many you have visited so far, and how do you get in touch with these key people, key informants that you interview in these different places, and possibly can you tell us about funding, about research funding? I know this is not an easy project to just do without any substantial financial support. If you have received any financial support or any grant from a research association or a research group, or if you are using personal funds, if you can shed more light on that, and then I'll get to invite Professor Rachel Rudolph.
So I have visited a large number of African nations. Probably easier for me to define and count how many I have not visited, and I can count those on my fingers. So that gives you a sense that if there are 54 African nations, I have visited the majority of them. And I have spent my, at least the last 3.5 decades traveling throughout the African continent and producing research on Africa, demographic research on Africa, political research on Africa, and engaging with social scientists who are engaging in this empirical research, cultural actors who are either themselves artists in some form or individuals who are curating trying to give voice to the creative experience of Africans. And I have gained access to so many people, sometimes by simply asking them. and telling them what project I'm doing and asking them if I can have access to them to talk about their point of view. Now, of course, heads of state have a lot of those kinds of requests. And so in order to gain access to heads of state, I had to use some of my contacts that I have built over the years in Africa and the United States to facilitate gaining access to them and getting them to sit down a moment with me. One of the most important collaborative relationships that I have been involved with was with Ambassador Charles Stith, who was the ambassador to Tanzania, and he organized a number of sessions called the African Presidential Roundtables. And on several occasions, he invited me to come and speak to heads of state, ministers of finance, ministers of various categories on the African continent, and to talk about the future of Africa, and especially the kind of demographic future of Africa. And I took that opportunity to reach out and shake their hands and to, get them to agree for me to come and visit them and talk to them about, some of these projects that we've had. And as a consequence of that, that opened up another entire realm of a relationship that I developed in many African nations. So when on our last trip, we wanted to visit museums and speak to museum curators and have access to filming in those museums. And so that really requires that you get permission from the government, the permission from the museum directors and things like that. And so we used the experience and the contacts we had already made to do that in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Morocco, in the various places that we visited for these particular documentaries. But for me, there is a consistent strain through the kind of demographic research that I've done, which is one way that national narratives are defined and that the definition of a nation is put forth. And this museum curation that I'm doing, which is definitely a way that national narratives are articulated, either about who the others are, and that's a way that people identify themselves by distinguishing themselves from those others. And so there's a certain thread which is through all of that, which has allowed me to always be doing multiple projects. And so when I'm visiting one place, I'm never doing just one thing in that place. I'm preparing for the next project and the next project and the next project, which is why I have all of these videos, which, have not made their way to television because they're not of that format. At least that's what the stations have told me. And if you know about my history, I've been on television a lot and for a long time. And I think the format can either limit or expand what you say. And that I think there's a need for an expansion. And this is that new space because it allows you to do what I might call communicasting, not just broadcasting, because you're actually in a conversation. So you're communicating as you broadcast, but people can feed back to you. They can ask you questions. They can create counter narratives about what you're saying. This is a wonderful moment because I do not think that the authority of what we broadcast needs to be captured by a few institutions which happen to have tons of resources to do it. I don't have tons of resources to do what I'm doing. A lot of it is grounded in my personal resources, but every now and then we get a little bit of money to help augment those activities and to help augment the footage that we've captured. And that might come through a museum giving us money to help curate a gallery, or it might come through a possible deal of putting something on television and they give you some resources to do it. And I just use it all to do what I think is important, which is to create these narratives. And so I'm going to continue doing that. And I have tons of footage which has never been shown. We spent about 5 months, for example, filming in Brazil. And from that will come several documentaries about the African presence in Brazil, and we still have more work that we have not shown about Africa. I mean, there's a part 2 to this African independence that we're in the process of creating as well.
That is wonderful, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for highlighting that. So I would like to bring in 2 people here, but let me start first with Professor Rachel Rudolph. She's joining us from China, and then I'll get to Mr. Olusola Akibinu. Professor Rachel, you can.
I have lots of questions, but the one I wanted to ask right now at this time is, do you have a favorite project out of all those that you've done, and why would that be your favorite project?
You know, so the one we decided to release first is African Independence. And the reason that is so close to my heart is both intellectually, but also because so many very important people gave me moments in their time. You know, I mean, if you show up to the office of a prime minister, that office is packed. I mean, line is outside. So for them to say, I'm going to give you 30 minutes is a big thing. Now, of course, I traveled a long way to get that 30 minutes. I've been waiting a long time, but that 30 minutes is just so valuable to me. And they just give up that time freely. And I thought that was a wonderful contribution to me having this project. And I really valued that time. But also, you know, some of these individuals that I interviewed were just members of they were revolutionaries, you know, and I spoke to some women who were revolutionaries that you wouldn't have thought of them as a revolutionary. Mukambi, which is one woman that I interviewed, and, you know, and we were walking around her house and she was telling me the things she did as a revolutionary. And now she's an older person, you know, and nobody is really focused a lot of attention on her and her activity. And I was really appreciative of her sharing her time with me so that I could you know, share her story. And then, you know, there's the substantive question, which is African independence, I believe, was the most important thing to happen on the African continent in the 20th century, because it changed Africa and it made something of Africa that is so important. But, you know, now that you made me think of it, the latest one I did before things fell apart has been part of my dream of doing this since 2003. We started filming in 2017 and we just completed the documentary. It's only a 1-hour documentary, and right now it's circulating and being shown in festivals around the world. But it meant a lot to me. Because part of it was based on a painting that my daughter, she's an artist, and she made a painting, and that painting represented a story that I told them while I was doing a postdoc in the 90s in Tanzania. And I was in Dar es Salaam, and I taught a couple of years at the University of Dar es Salaam. And so that meant a lot to me to finish that. We just recently finished it. It's just now being shown, and I'm hoping it receives the kind of reception that we did for African independence. You know, in African independence, we showed it all over the world. In some nations, they took and they broadcast it nationally. In other places, we just went to where they had a Black movement. So I showed it all over to Black movements in Latin America, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Brazil. And I would sit down and it would be rooms full of people involved in struggle, in Black movements, to raising Black consciousness. And we would look at this and talk about African independence and its relevance for the Black movement in Brazil, its relevance for the Black movement in Colombia. So I know it wasn't a straight answer, but that's what I have for you.
Wow, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Professor Rachel Rudolph, and thanks very much, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. So now I want to invite Mr. Olusola Akibinu, who joins us from Nigeria. This is your time.
Okay, thank you.
I cannot hear you. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, no, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, and I really enjoyed the narrative you created and even your work, so interesting. Now, I want to come back to the 14th fell apart because it is actually striking to me. Striking the context is what exactly is bothering me at the moment. I wrote a missive to Arnold Tida that was about yesterday. I'm trying to, what can we do concerning the fate of Africa in the world? And when I wrote it, a professor in Nigeria, a professor of international relations, read what I, and now came back appreciating what I said, now said something like, it looks like I'm looking at Africa from the contemporary experience and not looking at what exactly happened to Africa before we got to this. So it's like looking at something like a structure without not considering the substructure. So what it implies now, said, okay, now going back to what you said before things fall apart, that Africa was quite autonomous on its own and comfortable without all these challenges we have. And so the question now, coming back to the question is that how can we make Africa as of today autonomous and confident? You have taken this. You have taken the first step, which I would say first step. Pardon me by saying that, bringing back to a realization or self-realization, a confidence in ourselves, which is the culture. But if what Marx said was right, like the political superstructure rests upon the economic substructure, then if that is correct, it means that no matter how much you try to put a confidence in yourself, if you are not sure what you are going to eat and share shelter and basic provisions, you are likely going to sell that confidence off. So I feel that, I don't know how much work you have done, but what I can see, can you also bring the narrative of how Africa can be able to use its resources? You have talked about cobalt, you are talking about Congo, you are talking about even Nigeria or natural resources. We have more human, intellectual, social resources that are unformed. I'm talking of national intangible capital, process capital and all. It is not formed in Nigeria. So, and until we're able to do that, Dubai was carved from intangible resources, and it is everybody is putting all their money in Dubai. The contemporary African youth now do not even see the possibility of in Nigeria coming to place, but everybody wants to travel abroad. So, is it possible for you to involve in your work, seeing from what you have done? You brought a concept now, communicating. You are communicating, you are broadcasting in a way that are able to get responses, similar thing in which I'm able to do now all the way from far away Nigeria. I'm telling you now, is it possible for us in Nigeria to start taking statistics of number of handsets, handheld, number of volume of data, electricity that we use, and can we start redirecting our education so that our education can think of producing these things locally, so that our funds can recirculate? We can be able to start having an autonomous nation of ourselves, and not us living just as a market for China, as a market for Europe, as a market for Pakistan, for their drugs and things like that. That alone will not be able to have a confidence in the culture that you are already promoting. We will appreciate the culture, but when economic pushes us away from the distance, we will just see the culture as fantasy. All of us will see dream of every other person. You know, we are in the world, and people are in Pennsylvania around there, they are all in the world. But if we have an internal inferiority complex, we will always feel that our culture is inferior to people who have more economic provision. So can there be more work in that regard? If there is, I'll be willing to contribute in the limit of my capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, which is part of the conversation I'm trying to have. So I can't answer that question easily because you've asked a large question, okay? And it requires a lot of our attention. But let me try to answer or address a couple of dimensions of the question. I think if you don't have a good sense of where you came from, you are basically just a fool dangling, and anybody can tell you where you're going. If you don't know where you came from and you don't know where you are, then the person who does have a sense of where you are and has an idea about where they want you to go will direct you in that way. So we must develop a better understanding of African history and Africa's current situation. And so that requires both an attention to the past and more attention to how we understand that past now. That is, it's not just understanding the past for the past's sake, but understanding the past for helping us understand who we are and helping us understand what kind of world we're in. And part of the idea of even the title, Before Things Fell Apart, which kind of, things fall apart is what's in my mind. The heart of darkness, which things fell apart was a reaction to, is in my mind. And so my thinking about Before Things Fell Apart is very much trying to say, we need to reconsider what we think Africa is outside of the context of its relationship with the rest of the world. That is important. And this is why we now live in a world which is fundamentally based on the inequity which puts Africa in the situation that it's in. That is, Africa is not there simply because it's alone and because it's disconnected from China, disconnected from the United States, disconnected from Europe. Africa is in its situation today because of those connections. And since we have not had a renaissance, a renewal, a reconceptualization of what it means to be an African, what it means to be a human, and Africa's relationship with the rest of the world, we will be thinking that Africa is not the place with the great gold reserves, diamond reserves, copper reserves. We will simply think of Africa as a repository, right? As a place where you can go and get some diamonds, you can go and get some gold, you can go and get some oil, you can go and get some whatever is the wealth that is inside of Africa. And that's a certain position relative to the world. You can theorize it based on any economic paradigm you might have to do it, but it will fall down to basically considering, can Africa change its position in the world relative to the world, maintaining the relationships it has with the world? And the only way you will change those relationships, is by changing how things happen in Africa. I do one interview with Nkrumah's daughter, who is a politician in Ghana now. And I asked her specifically about what do we need to do to improve the situation in Africa. And she says, well, you're not going to simply undo the relationship that Africa has with the rest of the world. You can't do that simply. But what you can begin by doing is changing Africa's relationship with itself. So the relationship of Nigeria with Ghana, the relationship of South Africa with Mozambique, the relationship of SADC with ECOM, the relationship of North Africa with South Africa, the relationship of East Africa. We need to reconsider those things and reconfigure those relationships so that what the AU does, what the African Union does, begins to take a more powerful, have a more powerful impact on Africa's relationship with the rest of the world, and has a profound impact on Africa's relationship within the African continent. And as you know, in Nigeria, to have a better relationship between even the parts of Nigeria with itself, to give birth to a Nigeria which is one that is forward-thinking in this way, to give birth to a Ghana, which is one that is forward-thinking in this way. And I would add one component, which is connect Africa with its African diaspora. Connect Africa with its African diaspora. What would that mean? That would in itself already be a revolutionary act, because you would be connecting Africa with those individuals who have a historic connection to the African continent. And that needs to happen. That needs to happen for those communities and for the African continent. Thank you for your question. I know I didn't answer it all, but that's what we're trying to do. And that's why we say what we want to do is engage in a kind of broadcasting, which is not simply talking at people, but allowing people to talk back, and therefore creating a communicasting. Yeah, I like that.
Thank you, Professor Tukufu Zuberi, and thank you, Mr. Olusola, for that question. There's another hand that was raised by Damilare, and I understand he or she might be joining us from Nigeria. This is your time.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate your work. So I just want to ask a question. There is something that is driving force of the global culture, if I may say that, which is homogeneity. That means everybody just wants one single thing. Nobody wants to have multitude of options any longer. So in culture, it is common that American culture is the thing that is that everybody wants to copy. So such that even African songs have to be done in such a way to reflect American flavor. So how do you think we can promote our past in the face of this desire to have only one single narrative, global narrative? It could be Western, it could be American, it could be China in the next 50 years. How do we do that? Because most people are really not interested in the past, because they are just interested in the what I should call the prevailing narrative, which can be either be Chinese, it can be European, it can be American. And also in Africa, Africa is, even in Nigeria, we have hundreds of cultures. How do we make people appreciate this different culture, this bouquet of cultures, so that we can appreciate that we have thousands of cultures even in Africa, on African continent, and they are all beautiful in their own ways, against the general trend of one single line of thinking, one single line of culture, one single line of, you understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
how do we merge those two things? Thank you.
You know, the first thing I want to caution is against thinking that there's something called American culture, which is homogenized in itself, okay, that it represents something that's one thing. That is, that culture, which is called American culture, which is primarily talking about something that comes from the United States, is in itself already been fundamentally, profoundly transformed and impacted by African culture. When Africans came as enslaved individuals to the United States, they did not lose their culture. They did not become they did not experience social death. They did not experience cultural death. So when you look at something like rap music is as much African as it is US. Now, when you listen to those griots that I was talking about that we listened to in this film, Before Things Fell Apart, you see those griots giving this story, and they're coming from a tradition that is thousands of years old, okay? It's not something that just got created in the 60s or in the 70s, thousands of years old. This is the precursor to rap music, whether that rap music is being played in the United States or being played in Brazil or being played in Nigeria or any of those places. Now, that's just one thing, is that that particular act is not in itself something which is just a reflection of American culture. But that is different. That is very different from that part of American culture which is mass mediated, which is put in a package and sold, which is sold in a way to be replicated in a particular form with a specific message. But I think that even if you got into how that particular form, let's say call it rap or hip hop music, was transmitted to the world, and you look at it, I think that what you will see is the form of that music that has been mass mediated is varied. So if you look at the music of Public Enemy or KRS-One or some of these other groups, and you compare that, or the music of Racional in Sao Paulo in Brazil, if you look at these people and their kind of renditions of rap, you get something that's very close to what these griots were doing in their effort to be historical and to deliver a historical and uplifting message that people take and carry on and work out their life, and creating a narrative which connects back to Africa and what they are doing. So I just wanted to caution that in terms of just what the American form is, and to say that's different than mass mediation, because as you know, the US will mass mediate and mass advertise what you drink. So whether it is bottled water or Coca-Cola, the mass mediation is a way of presenting a product to you that they want you to buy. And so one way of selling that product is to say, this is the way that you should drink. You should drink your sugar like this. You should drink your water like this. And the mass and the place to get it, the place to get the good sugar water or the place to get the good pure water is to buy it from this particular space, from this particular company, or to listen to it in this particular form. And that is a certain kind of mass mediation which attempts to squeeze everything into one bottle and to put everything under a specific brand or label. And that in itself is contrary to understanding and appreciating the need for cultural understanding, which I think is what we need. So for example, you saw in the little clip I played about the redesign of the Penn Museum Africa galleries. At the end, I spoke to one of the chiefs from Edo, and I asked him, the question I asked him is, what about showing these products from the great Benin society that were stolen from Benin? What about showing them in Western museums? And you see his comment was basically, yes, they should be circulated around the world because these are some of the most important cultural contributions to humanity. Now, of course, it's an elevation, and it informs us about Edo culture and about Benin and the great societies in Africa, but it is a part of human culture and everyone needs to know about it. Now, there's another question, which is, who do those things belong to? And where should they be housed and stored? And where should the ownership be grounded? Now, that is a question which deals with the theft. That is a question which deals with Africa's economic relationship to the rest of the world and how that economic relationship influences our cultural production. So we might want the cultural circulation of Edo culture, of Benin culture around the world, but we want to reestablish the ownership of that culture, reestablish the historical priority of understanding Edo culture today, understanding Benin society today. So I would say that we need a conversation which gets us beyond the simple branding and the branding of culture and moves us to the state of understanding and embracing our diversity as human beings and using that diversity and using that embracing of diversity as a way of asserting a new humanity, one which rejects the marginalization of people as simple consumers of sweet water or of some particular brand that they should buy because it will enrich a very small group of people who happen to be based outside of Africa.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. I was just having a conversation just now with Dr. Ebun Joseph, who just recently posted a question here and as well as a comment. So Dr. Ebun Joseph, are you able to ask this question? Are you able to connect, or I can ask it for you?
Just that I can't turn on my camera, so if you want to ask it, it's fine. I can't turn on my camera, sorry.
No worries.
Hi, Tukufu.
Hey, how are you, my sister?
I'm very good, very good.
This woman is a very important critical race scholar in Ireland who is doing some fantastic work there. Check her work out. Okay?
You can say that again. You can say that again.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ebun Joseph, you can ask the question. We can see your picture, so it's pretty fun. Yeah.
I guess my question really was just looking at, I think your last question kind of answered it a bit because I took a few notes. One of the challenges I have, particularly when I'm teaching Black studies, I'm teaching on African history, so I like, you coin it as, Africa before before things fell apart, so I always talk about how we learn the stereotypes and how we learn the prejudices, where we learn them from. So I go back to before, the struggle, which is what is in a lot of our curriculum and in our schools. So if you look at, if you're here in Ireland anyway, if we're being taught anything about Africa, it's about the struggle, it's about, colonization and all of those things. But it's like, who were those people before all of that fell apart? But one of the challenges I have, particularly when I'm speaking to maybe businesses, it's Black History Month in the US now, it's October for us here in Ireland. So when we do, events on Black History Month and we present, things that, amplify the value of Africa, the questions or the pushback that I would get sometimes would be people who really want to focus a lot on the, maybe bad governance, the fact that, African people were part of the colonization as well, that they sold their brothers into slavery, so that would be a lot of the pushback. I guess my question in a roundabout way is, so you talked about how we should talk about Africa, in a new way, in that conversation. So how do we address this without also falling into the danger of a single story, even if it's just a positive story we're telling of Africa?
And I think that what we need is a more cogent narrative of human history. We need a way of talking about people which doesn't necessitate rendering certain people inferior. So for example, there is this idea that when people talk about European history, that they end up trying to say, well, Europe was the only place to develop capitalism because of Western philosophy, Western science, and Western economic this. And so in some ways, the discussion about capitalism necessitates a marginalization in the narrative of Africa. And the discussion about modernist civilization necessitates a marginalization of Africa in the conversation. Now, this has a long tradition in Western thought. You find it in Rousseau, you find it in Hegel, you find it in so many spaces where Africa is rendered historyless, where Africa is talked about as if it was not part of human history, and that somehow there was this dark continent, and that's why I think it's so important to read the philosophical dimension that is contained within Things Fell Apart, because that's a deep book. Because he's responding to this idea that Africa is the dark place and that you can enter it in the dark. You can enter the darkness of Africa. And in that is a suggestion that if you can remove your brain from Africa ever being this dark continent, you will find that Africa has always been a place contending with the same problems as the rest of the world, but also providing solutions to the rest of the world. There's this guy named Mansa Musa, Kankan Mansa Musa, who was a king of Mali. And he made a very famous pilgrimage across Africa, where he took so much gold that he reduced the price of gold once he arrived in Mecca. He was going on his Hajj to Mecca. And he bought homes in Cairo, homes in Medina, homes all over the place. As he made his trek back, he even brought architects with him to help build some buildings in Mali. And they still exist in Mali today. Now, why do I tell this story? I tell this story not to say that he was a bringer of general equality on the African continent, but just as a story of an actor who had a transformative impact on humanity by a simple act that he engaged in, but that is a reflection of the great wealth which was accumulated in that particular place on the African continent. And why do we need to know that? Because it is important to know that in the 14th century, before enslavement, in the 14th century, Africa had contact with the rest of the world. Everybody already knew about Mali. Everyone all over the planet knew about Timbuktu. Everybody all over the planet knew about the Ghana mines and the gold that was being taken from them. So it's not like people didn't have knowledge about Africa. And in order to even make people ignorant of that history, Napoleon had to go to Africa. He went to Egypt and he took some people that became Egyptologists and created the discipline of Egyptology. And they spent 100 and more years trying to say that Egypt is not part of Africa. And they have displayed this hypocrisy and this deception all over museums in Europe and in the United States. But it becomes part of a national narrative of forgetting about Africa and forgetting about Africa and its contact with the rest of the world. And this idea that Europeans enslaved Africa and that's what brought Africans into modernity is an absurd notion. Africa was essential for the creation of the modern world. If you didn't have Africa, you wouldn't have that world. And that if you did not have African laborers, you would not have had the production processes which stimulated the financial base which gives us the modern society, gives us the modern economies that we are looking at. And so I say all that to say this. To be able to understand where we are now requires a rewriting of where we think we came from to get here. That's why if people start with some notion that Africans were socially dead when they arrived in Brazil, socially dead when they arrived in the US, socially dead when they arrived in France, when they arrived in Belgium, when they arrived in Britain, if you start with that idea, then you'll get a history which is truncated. It will start with Britain. It will start with the United States. It will start with Brazil. And then Africa's history will start after colonialism, because before colonialism, it will be something that's kind of told in this narrative of darkness, like the Benin Kingdom. The Benin Kingdom knew of Europe. You look at some of these sculptures and they will be of Europeans in the 15th century, of Europeans in the 16th century. So it's not like Benin was disconnected in the dark continent and Europe was all over there with all the light. It's because Benin was connected to humanity and connected to the world as one of the great nations, the great empires in that particular moment. I mean, it's kind of like people forget that if you look at Morocco, for example, Morocco had a war that occurred in the 16th century. And this war, they defeated the Portuguese. And in defeating the Portuguese, it led to the exploration of different parts of Africa, because they thought they could just run over Morocco and go straight to Timbuktu and go straight from Timbuktu to getting some of that gold, which they knew was there. But the trade route brought the gold through these places. When they were defeated in Morocco, that sent them another place. But their defeat in Morocco also armed the Moroccans with some weapons and other technology that they used to defeat the Songhai Empire and to create a different kind of geopolitics in the western part of the African continent. So what I'm saying is that we need to tell those stories in order to reconnect ourselves and make the narrative of history whole. You can't know European history without understanding African history. You cannot know US history without understanding African history. You cannot understand Brazilian history without that connection with African history. This disconnecting Africa from the rest of the world is a way of distorting our potential for understanding today what it means to be a human being.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I have one last hand coming. Thank you very much, Dr. Ebun Joseph. Once again, I have one last question that's coming from Mr. Jeffrey Masia Chengo, who is joining me and who's joining us from Zimbabwe. Mr. Jeffrey, this is your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. We are enjoying that. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me come in with my question. I hope you can hear me, Professor.
I can hear you clearly.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm down in Zimbabwe there. All right, my question is, what do you think is the main challenge of our education system, particularly Southern Africa? I think you have done a thorough research in all African countries. But what do you think is the major problem in our education system in terms of trying to keep us abreast with whatever is happening around us? What do you think is the main challenge with our education system?
Thank you. Zimbabwe is one of my favorite countries. I've had some wonderful time there. If we were in the other room in my house, you'd see all of this Shona art behind me. So, you know, I've had wonderful times in Zimbabwe, and I look for the opportunity return, and I'm so glad to see the acceleration of the political voice of the Zimbabwean people as you reconstruct and reconstitute Zimbabwe. And that's what I think our educational systems need to do. You know, the educational institutions in Africa need to become more African. They need to articulate a history which does this reconnection. In Southern Africa, we need to teach the history of Southern Africa, the relationship, the historical relationship, right? You know, there's some people there called Indabele, I think, I'm not sure, but you know, their relationship to these people in the deep parts of South Africa, or these people in Southern Africa related to these people in Mozambique, related to these people in Angola, related to these people in Tanzania, related to these people in Kenya. There are relationships which exist, which serve as the basis for a way to teach history in Africa. All right. And telling those narratives, because it's not only the narrative of the great Shaka Zulu or the Great Wall in Zimbabwe, or there are many narratives to be told about Southern Africa that will elevate our understanding of what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. And what do I mean by that? Often, the history of Africa is told in a very narrow and Eurocentric way, right? And I don't know the specific institutions that you're talking about, so I won't presume to say what they are teaching in those specific institutions, but I just want to say about the educational structure in Africa that it must first prioritizing becoming more African. I mean, that's just as a point of departure. It must be the place that when you start your study of Africa, it should be with African scholarship, either the African scholarship of the past, hence this film, Before Things Fell Apart, is focusing on African scholarship before the main authorities on Africa were found outside of Africa, right? I mean, you have people who will do a film on ancient Africa, and they don't even have to talk to no Africans. In fact, they can come to Africa, film some stuff in places in Africa, and then come back to the US and talk to scholars in the US. Now, of course, some of those scholars in the US might be from Africa, but they don't even have to be scholars from Africa. They don't have to have no relationship to Africa. So what I'm saying is that the first thing we need to hear in understanding African society and African history is an African voice. And we need to allow and facilitate giving voice to those voices about Africa. That's important. It is very important. It is something that we have ignored for too long and something that we have to cultivate. And then we create conversation among those African scholars with their various African diasporas, whether that African diaspora is in Asia, in India, in Dubai, wherever those African diasporas are, in Europe, wherever those African diasporas are in Latin America, wherever those African diasporas are in the Americas, wherever they are, creating a bigger conversation and pulling the world into that conversation. Because it's not that that conversation shouldn't be taking place with scholars of Europe, with scholars of Asia, but that we must give voice to all of these spaces and all of these communities of intellectual scholarship to talk about Africa. The university system in the United States has been and continues to be, to a large extent, Eurocentric. It focuses on and prioritizes knowledge which comes from Europe, knowledge which is produced in a tradition of allegiance intellectually to Europe. It's why Hegel is important. It's why Rousseau is important. It's why Socrates is important. And do you know who al-Sadi is? Do you know about Tariq al-Sudan? Do we know who the great African scholars were? Not just the ones from Egypt, but the ones from Kono, the ones from East Africa, the ones from West Africa, the ones from South Africa. Do we know who they are? Are we communicating about them? Do we know what they philosophically said about where Africa should go? Are we kind of in a critical dialogue with them? Sometimes our own critical dialogue about Africa is just about Hegel and what Hegel said. And you wouldn't even know that they had philosophers in Africa. They had mathematicians in Africa in the days of old. Now we know they got African philosophers now, and they got African mathematicians now, and they have African historians now. So that in some ways we have to foster this communication, this conversation. That's why my products my research tries to forefront a conversation in Africa with Africans to talk about what's going on, to try to channel those voices in this communicasting that we're talking about. So these schools need to prioritize African knowledge creation.
Thank you, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. I do remember having an interview again with Professor Sabelo Gatsheni Ndlovu, who is in Germany currently, and I was interviewing him about his book that he had just published last year about decolonizing the education system in Africa, and particularly South Africa. And he was talking about epistemic freedom. And he was particularly concerned about the knowledge production of the African continent, arguing that we need to initially decolonize the system that we already have so that we can be able to put in place knowledge systems and the knowledge production that is primarily rooted upon the African culture, the African language, and the African way of doing things. Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Jeffrey Masiachengo, who's joining me from Zimbabwe. Now, I just want to bring in one last question, Professor Tukufu Zuberi, if we still have time. Just one last question that's coming from Ruvarashe Masocha, who happens to be a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa. Ruvarashe, this is your time.
Thank you, Anutida, and thank you, Professor Tukufu. I'm curious about filmmaking and digital history, and like one of my comms fields is on digital history. So I would like you to comment on how that maybe creates a platform where the discussions we are having or the arguments we are making right now can cease to be part of just the academic circles and move to be part of public discussions or engage with activists and the everyday people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 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 yes. That is why I'm doing what I am doing. I think it is so important.
That's why we are doing what we are doing.
Exactly. That's why we're doing it. That's why I called my brother. I said, come on, let's talk about this thing. And he set this up immediately. All right. And that's a beautiful thing. And I love you, man. I love you for that, because what you do is in the beginning, it's in front of this idea of communicasting that I'm talking about. By setting up his station, y'all got to check it out. He be having some real serious conversations taking place on his station. You got the link to it. Click on it, check it out. You will see all the back stuff and stay up on it because he got stuff coming. Let me say this. We need to engage in that digital world and not to wait to be financed by those other resources. It's very important. And I'll tell you a little story, okay? I went to, there's a big television station, and I went to that television station and I showed them my film, Before Things Fell Apart. And you know, and they after a back and forth, we decided to go this way. And let me tell you, one of the people who works at the station, all right, okay, I hope he's not looking and his station's not looking, but one of the people who worked at the station, he said, you know what? You don't really need this anymore, man. He said, actually, you can get more coverage of the information, if that's what you're interested in, by just putting it out to the world. If you already have it, give it to the world and let people experience it. And these digital forms of communication, like YouTube today, Vimeo tomorrow, Facebook today, Instagram tomorrow, Twitter yesterday, whatever it is giving you access to talk to people beyond the limited confines of those who have the resources to pay for everything. And they will mass mediate a form of narrative, a way of speaking, which determines and over-determines, I might say, the kind of narratives that we hear, the kind of information that we hear. So these digital medias are offering a democratic way to present alternative narratives. So when I think, for example, of African-American history, there is a kind of straight and narrow African-American history that people will deliver, and they will mainly think about delivering it in the month of February. And for me, the month of February is just, you know, it's a month of February here, it's a month of October in Ireland, it's the month of November in Brazil. You got these different months where now they're focusing on their Black people, on their African people. And I'm like, what about the other times? Are y'all just lying and acting like these people don't exist? And that is the narrative that you get, is that people are being written out of the voice. Their voice is not being included in the conversations unless it follows a prescribed format. And we do not have to do that. We can break it. We can have independent voices, which are more critical voices, institutionally critical, and not dependent on the funding, which will attempt to narrow that voice and make what people think is going on come out in a certain way. You know, like, you know, you have all of these aid agencies. In this series that I'm showing now called African Independence, in this series, what you will see is you will see African heads of state talk about how aid has destroyed Africa. Aid is not good for Africa. And that's not something to just kind of, what do you mean don't give the aid to Africa? What I mean is that the aid is one of the problems that Africa is suffering from. And the people who think that they're solving Africa's problem because they're giving grants to Africa, those are the same people that will give you a grant to do a project in a certain way. but they're going to ask you to research a certain thing. And they're going to ask you to provide your information in a certain way. And the only way you're going to be able to break that is to break how you present your information. So if you want to do it in a creative, innovative way that goes beyond the limitations of the standard accepted voice, you have to find a way to digitize it and to circulate the information in this digital format. And that's what we need to do. We need to go beyond them. And it's just technology is allowing us to have a more democratic circulation of information. And documentaries should be this way anyway. If you're documenting information, it should not be censored by those who have the resources to pay for it. It should not be owned by those who have the resources to pay for it. We must find a way to circulate the information, irregardless of the amount of resources we have to do that. We don't have to be in the position of mass mediating, right? So there's a rap, which I know that I grew up on, which is purifying and clarifying to my soul. I gave y'all a couple of people who did that kind of rap. You know, and that's what I know is right. And then there's the rap, which is mass mediated. I'm not even going to mention those people because those are the ones that jumped into your mind when I said rap, because the narrative of who they are and what they do has been mass mediated. Well, we need to create a counter to the mass mediation, which is providing information and allowing people to talk back to us.
Thank you very much, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. That is wonderful. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for the questions. Those of you who have joined us on this discussion, I'm very much glad that you joined. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to have a conversation of their outstanding publications, of their outstanding contribution to knowledge production, be it in written form, be it documentaries, be it films, whatever it is, as long as it falls under this category. I'm very much happy to have heard Professor Tukufu Zuberi. Viewers and listeners, Professor Tukufu Zuberi is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the Center for African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And the YouTube channel that he just recently launched can be accessed on a link that I've just pasted in the comment section on our Facebook and on our YouTube. Please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy. I encourage all the professors on this discussion, and as well as those that are watching and those that are going to watch a premiering video on our YouTube, to use these videos for the course outlines for the all sorts of different disciplines that we are engaged in teaching. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on this talk show. Have a good day.
Ciao. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.